Welcome to Luxury Empire Stories.
The ink on the divorce papers was barely dry when Dominic let out a low, arrogant laugh, a smirk that told the whole room he thought he had won. He looked across the mahogany table at his ex-wife, a woman he believed was nothing more than a quiet, penniless bookstore clerk he'd outgrown, and slid the Cartier pen back into his pocket. He was walking away with the house, the car, and his brilliant tech startup. What Dominic didn't know as he strutted out of that glass-walled boardroom to meet his new mistress was that the woman sitting behind him wasn't a nobody. She was Clara Montgomery, and by signing that paper, he hadn't just secured his freedom. He had legally signed away his right to a $20 billion global empire. The air in the high-rise office of Heiress and Associates was sterile, smelling faintly of lemon polish and expensive leather. Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the grey sprawl of Seattle. But inside the boardroom, the temperature felt like a freezing void. Clara sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap. She wore a simple beige trench coat over a modest navy blue dress, an outfit Dominic had once called aggressively boring. Her posture was impeccable, a trait drilled into her since childhood by private tutors, though Dominic always just assumed she had a stiff back from carrying too many library books. Across from her sat Dominic Blackwood. He was leaning back in his plush leather chair, his tailored charcoal suit pulling slightly at the shoulders. He looked like a man who had just won the lottery, tapping his phone screen with a rhythmic, impatient energy. Clara knew who was on the other end of those texts. Chloe Hastings, the 24-year-old marketing executive Dominic had met at a networking event 6 months ago. Chloe was everything Dominic thought he deserved. Loud, flashy, draped in designer labels, and relentlessly ambitious. "Are we almost done here, Andrew?" Dominic asked, checking his Rolex, a gift Clara had bought him for their 3rd anniversary, saving up her bookstore wages for an entire year to afford it. Andrew Harrison, the senior partner and a man who looked like he had been practicing law since the invention of paper, adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses. He shot Dominic a look of profound distaste before turning his soft, steady gaze back to Clara. "Mrs. Blackwood," Andrew said, his voice a gravelly baritone, "I want to be entirely sure you understand the stipulations of this agreement. Mr. Blackwood is claiming full ownership of Blackwood Tech Solutions. In exchange, he is leaving you the remaining balance of the joint savings account, roughly $22,000, and he is taking the mortgage of the suburban property, effectively buying you out of your share for a sum of $40,000. Clara looked at the document. $62,000. That was the price tag Dominic had put on 5 years of marriage. 5 years of her cooking his meals, editing his terrible business proposals, and quietly paying his early startup server costs from her own secret savings, while letting him believe he had secured angel investments. "I understand, Andrew," Clara said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Dominic scoffed, a short, sharp sound of amusement. "Let's be real, Harrison. It's more than fair. I built the company. Clara reads. I think she'll be fine. 60 grand is more than enough for a fresh start in a nice, quiet apartment somewhere. Maybe Portland." He was patronizing her. He was sitting there, chest puffed out, genuinely believing he had financially outmaneuvered a woman he thought was a simpleton. "If you are certain, Clara," Andrew said, sliding the heavy, ivory-colored parchment across the table. Clara picked up the standard-issue ballpoint pen. She didn't hesitate. She didn't cry. She signed her name with a fluid, elegant cursive, Clara E. Montgomery. Dominic snatched the paper back the second her pen lifted. He scrawled his own name, aggressive and jagged, before throwing the pen onto the table. It clattered loudly in the quiet room, and then he smirked. It was a small, asymmetrical lifting of his left cheek, a smirk of absolute triumph. It was the look of a man who believed he had just shed dead weight. He stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. "No hard feelings, Clara," Dominic said, not looking her in the eye. "People grow apart. I'm playing in a different league now. You'll find someone who fits your pace." Clara looked up at him. For the first time in 6 months, she smiled. It wasn't a sad smile, nor an angry one. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated relief. "Goodbye, Dominic," she said softly. Dominic turned and walked out of the glass doors. Through the frosted panels, Clara watched him greet a blonde woman waiting in the lobby. Chloe. They kissed, Dominic wrapping an arm around her waist as they stepped into the elevator, descending back into the city, completely unaware of the bomb that had just been diffused in Clara's life. When the elevator doors finally chimed shut, the oppressive silence in the boardroom vanished. Andrew Harrison let out a long, heavy sigh, taking off his glasses and rubbing the bridge of his nose. "In my 40 years of practicing law, Clara, I have never met a man so eagerly sprint toward his own financial execution." Clara stood up, smoothing down her navy dress. Her meek demeanor evaporated instantly. The slump in her shoulders vanished, replaced by a commanding, aristocratic poise. "He wanted everything he thought I had, Andrew," Clara said, her voice no longer a whisper, but a crisp, authoritative alto. "Let him have it." Andrew chuckled, opening a locked drawer in his desk and pulling out a massive, leather-bound portfolio stamped with a gold crest. "Your grandfather called 3 times this morning. He is, to put it mildly, impatient. Now that the marriage is dissolved and the prenuptial anonymity clause is fulfilled, the transition can begin." Clara looked at the gold crest, the crest of Montgomery Global Holdings. Shipping, commercial real estate, telecommunications, and a private equity firm that practically owned half of Wall Street. "Tell grandfather," Clara said, slipping on her sunglasses, "that the heiress is finally coming home. To understand how a billionaire heiress ended up in a sterile law office accepting a $62,000 divorce settlement, one had to understand William Montgomery." William, Clara's grandfather, was a self-made titan. He had clawed his way up from the docks of Boston to build an empire. He despised high society frivolity, trust fund brats, and gold diggers. When Clara, his sole living heir after the tragic passing of her parents, turned 21, William gave her a mandate. "You will not inherit a single share of my company until you prove you can live without it." For 7 years, Clara was cut off. She was given a fake identity, Clara Brooks, and relocated to Seattle. She was tasked with living an ordinary life, surviving on an ordinary wage, to understand the value of a dollar and the reality of the world her grandfather's employees lived in. She got a job at an independent bookstore, living in a cramped, drafty apartment, and that was where she met Dominic. Dominic had been a charming, struggling software developer who came into the bookstore to use the free Wi-Fi. He was passionate, driven, and fiercely ambitious. He talked about changing the world, about building an app that would revolutionize supply chain logistics. Clara, starved for genuine connection in her isolated, undercover life, fell hard. When they married, Dominic was broke. Clara loved him for his potential, for the fire in his eyes. She quietly supported him. When his laptop broke, she won a raffle and gave him a new one. When he couldn't afford rent for his first office space, she took on extra shifts and borrowed from a friend to cover it. In reality, she was quietly dipping into the very small emergency fund her grandfather allowed her. But as Dominic's company, Blackwood Tech, started to gain traction, Dominic began to change. His first major contract brought in $2 million. Suddenly, the man who used to share a plate of cheap spaghetti with her in their living room was wearing imported Italian suits and complaining about the thread count of their sheets. He started attending high-roller networking events, leaving Clara behind because, in his words, "You wouldn't understand the jargon, babe. You'd just be bored." The tipping point was Chloe Hastings. Chloe was brought into Blackwood Tech as the new head of PR. She was ruthless, sharp, and recognized Dominic's rising star. She also recognized that Dominic was deeply insecure, desperate to be viewed as an elite. Chloe fed that ego. She told him he was a genius, a visionary, a titan of industry. Clara had noticed the late-night texts, the sudden business trips to Aspen and Miami, the smell of expensive, cloying perfume on his shirts. When Clara finally confronted him, standing in the kitchen of the modern townhouse she had helped him decorate, Dominic didn't even have the grace to look guilty. "Look at us, Clara," he had said, pouring himself a glass of Macallan. "I'm scaling a tech firm that's about to go public. You're still recommending paperback novels to college kids. We're in different stratospheres. I need a partner who can stand beside me in a boardroom, not someone who shrinks in a crowd." Chloe understands the game. He had asked for the divorce the next morning. What Dominic didn't know was that the supply chain logistics app he had built, the very foundation of his wealth, was built entirely on architecture Clara had subtly corrected for him years ago, drawing on the shipping logistics knowledge she had absorbed growing up in the Montgomery household. More importantly, Dominic didn't know that his biggest client, the anchor investor keeping his entire company afloat, was Apex Freight. And Apex Freight was a minor, insignificant subsidiary of Montgomery Global Holdings. 3 weeks after the divorce was finalized, Seattle's elite gathered at the Emerald City Museum of Modern Art for the annual Pacific Northwest Innovation Gala. It was the social event of the year, a place where multi-million-dollar deals were struck over champagne and caviar. Dominic arrived in a tailored velvet tuxedo, a smug smile plastered on his face. On his arm was Chloe, wearing a sheer sequined gown that left little to the imagination. They looked the part of the city's new it couple. "Tonight is the night," Dominic whispered to Chloe, snagging 2 flutes of champagne from a passing waiter. "The CEO of Apex Freight is supposed to be here. If I can get 5 minutes with him, I can secure the Series B funding. Once we have that, Blackwood Tech goes global." Chloe kissed his cheek, leaving a faint smudge of crimson lipstick. "You're brilliant, Dom. You're going to own this room. Just think, a month ago you were tied down to a librarian." Dominic chuckled, taking a sip of his drink. "Thank God I cut the dead weight when I did. If she were here, she'd be hyperventilating in a corner." Across the sprawling ballroom, the lights suddenly dimmed. A single sweeping spotlight hit the grand marble staircase at the back of the hall. The murmur of the crowd died down as the host, the mayor of Seattle, stepped up to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," the mayor's voice boomed through the speakers, "tonight we have a very special guest. As many of you know, the backbone of our city's shipping and tech infrastructure has long been supported by Montgomery Global Holdings. For years, the leadership of this incredible conglomerate has remained mysterious, guided from the shadows by the legendary William Montgomery." Dominic leaned over to Chloe. "Montgomery Global, that's the white whale. If I could ever get a meeting with them, we'd be billionaires." "Hush," Chloe whispered, her eyes glued to the staircase. "Listen." "Tonight," the mayor continued, "William Montgomery officially steps down, and for the first time his successor, the new CEO and sole heir to the Montgomery Empire, is stepping into the public eye. Please welcome Miss Clara Montgomery." The heavy mahogany doors at the top of the staircase swung open. Dominic took a sip of champagne, waiting to see the face of the billionaire heiress. A woman stepped out onto the landing. She was draped in a breathtaking, custom-made emerald green gown that seemed to catch every light in the room. Around her neck sat a diamond necklace that cost more than Dominic's entire company. Her hair, usually tied up in a messy bun, fell in sleek, perfect waves down her back. Her posture was regal, terrifying, and utterly flawless. Dominic's champagne flute slipped from his fingers. It hit the marble floor with a sharp crack, shattering into 100 pieces. The sound echoed perfectly in the silent room. Chloe jumped, glaring at him. "Dominic, what is wrong with you?" But Dominic couldn't hear her. All the blood had drained from his face. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He stared at the staircase, his mouth slightly open, his mind violently rejecting what his eyes were seeing. It was impossible. It was a joke. It was a hallucination brought on by stress. But as the woman slowly descended the marble stairs, her gaze sweeping over the crowd of Seattle's wealthiest elites like a queen inspecting her subjects, her eyes momentarily locked onto Dominic's. She paused, just for a fraction of a second, and then Clara Montgomery smirked. It wasn't an arrogant smirk like Dominic's at the divorce table. It was cold. It was calculating. It was the look of a predator acknowledging a speck of dust before wiping it away. Dominic's knees went weak. The woman he had discarded, the woman he had given a pitying $62,000 settlement, was the heir to $20 billion. "Dom," Chloe asked, shaking his arm. "Dom, why are you looking at her like that? Who is that?" Dominic couldn't breathe. That's my ex-wife." The morning after the Pacific Northwest Innovation Gala, the penthouse of the Four Seasons, where Dominic and Chloe had moved to celebrate his new life, felt like a tomb. Dominic paced the length of the living room, his phone pressed to his ear. He was dialing Clara's old number for the 15th time. For the 15th time, an automated voice informed him that the number was disconnected. He threw the phone onto the velvet sofa, running a hand through his hair. His hands were shaking. Chloe emerged from the bedroom, wearing a silk robe and a deeply unhappy expression. She held her tablet, scrolling rapidly through the morning business news. "It's everywhere," Chloe snapped, her voice shrill, lacking its usual sultry tone. The Wall Street Journal, Forbes, the local Seattle Times, the lost Montgomery heir, steps into the light. "Dominic, you told me your ex-wife sorted paperbacks and clipped coupons." "She did," Dominic yelled, turning on her. "She drove a 10-year-old Honda Civic. She bought generic brand coffee. I lived with the woman for 5 years, Chloe. I think I would know if she was sitting on $20 billion. "Well, you clearly didn't," Chloe shot back, tossing the tablet onto the coffee table. The screen displayed a high-resolution photo of Clara from the night before, looking like royalty in her emerald gown. "Do you realize what this means for us? For Blackwood Tech, Apex Freight is our anchor client. They provide 60% of our revenue. Apex Freight is owned by Montgomery Global. Your ex-wife literally owns our lifeline." Dominic sank into a leather armchair, burying his face in his hands. The arrogance that had defined him at the divorce table was entirely gone, replaced by a suffocating, icy panic. "She wouldn't sink the company," he muttered, trying to convince himself. She's soft. She's gentle. She used to cry during dog food commercials. She wouldn't vindictively destroy my life." Chloe crossed her arms, a calculating gleam in her eyes. "Soft women don't wear $20 million diamonds and smirk at you from a grand staircase, Dom. She played you. You need to fix this. Call her. Beg her. Do whatever you have to do, or the Series B funding is dead, and we are bankrupt in 3 months." While Dominic spiraled into panic, Clara Montgomery was drinking a perfectly brewed espresso in the penthouse office of Montgomery Tower. The transition from the cramped, dusty bookstore to this sprawling, glass-walled sanctum felt entirely natural. It was the life she had been bred for. Across her massive mahogany desk sat Gabriel Smith, the chief financial officer of Montgomery Global, and Fiona Caldwell, her newly appointed chief of staff. "Good morning, Miss Montgomery," Gabriel said, sliding a thick file across the desk. "As requested, I've pulled the complete financial dossier on Blackwood Tech Solutions, along with their active contract with our subsidiary, Apex Freight." Clara opened the file. She traced the numbers with her manicured fingernail. "They are burning through capital at an alarming rate, Gabriel. Look at these expense reports. Private jet charters for a mid-level tech firm, a new corporate headquarters lease in Bellevue." Mr. Blackwood has been operating under the assumption that his Series B funding round will close by the end of the quarter, Fiona chimed in, adjusting her tablet. He has leveraged almost all of their current assets against the projected revenue from the Apex freight expansion contract. Clara leaned back in her chair, a cold, serene smile touching her lips. He's spending money he doesn't have, counting on a contract he hasn't officially secured. Classic Dominic. "What would you like to do, Ma'am?" Gabriel asked. "We can terminate the Apex contract immediately. The breach of performance clauses are quite broad. Blackwood Tech has missed 3 minor delivery milestones in the last 6 weeks due to their focus on PR over product." "No," Clara said softly, closing the file. "If we terminate the contract outright, he plays the victim. He'll tell the press his vindictive billionaire ex-wife crushed his brilliant startup out of spite. He might even find a sympathy investor. We don't just want to break his company, Gabriel. We want to expose that it was never his to begin with." Clara unlocked the bottom drawer of her desk and pulled out a faded, blue manila folder. It was a stark contrast to the sleek corporate documents in the room. She handed it to Gabriel. Before Dominic incorporated Blackwood Tech, he couldn't figure out the core algorithm for the supply chain routing, Clara explained, her voice steady. He spent months banging his head against a wall. So one weekend, while he was out networking, I rewrote the foundational code. Because I knew the industry, because I grew up listening to my grandfather yell about logistics and shipping routes over breakfast. Gabriel opened the blue folder, his eyes widening as he read the documents inside. "I registered the patent for that core architecture under a private LLC to protect him from poachers," Clara continued. "Bluebird Solutions. I handed him the code and told him I found an open-source framework online. He never questioned it. He built his entire billion-dollar valuation on a foundation he doesn't own." Gabriel looked up, a slow grin spreading across his face. "Miss Montgomery, Bluebird Solutions holds the exclusive rights to the Blackwood algorithm. He is effectively leasing his own product, and he doesn't even know it." "Exactly," Clara said. "Fiona, notify Apex Freight to freeze all pending invoices to Blackwood Tech, pending an intellectual property audit. Let's see how Dominic handles the heat when the oxygen is sucked out of the room." By Thursday, the atmosphere inside Blackwood Tech Solutions was toxic. Dominic was screaming at his CFO, a balding man named Peter, inside his glass-walled corner office. Outside, dozens of employees were trying not to stare, their anxiety palpable. "What do you mean, frozen?" Dominic roared, slamming his fist on his desk. "Apex owes us $3.2 million for the Q2 deliverables. They can't just freeze the payout." Peter wiped sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief. "Dominic, they invoked Section 4 of the vendor agreement, a standard intellectual property audit. They claim there are irregularities in our code ownership documentation. Until the audit is cleared, Montgomery Global's legal department has put a hard stop on all capital transfers." "It's her," Dominic hissed, pacing frantically. "This is Clara. She's suffocating us. How much runway do we have, Peter? Honestly." Peter looked down at his shoes. "If we don't get that invoice paid by the 15th, we can't make payroll. The Bellevue lease deposit cleared our reserve accounts yesterday. Dominic, we are completely over-leveraged." The door to the office flew open, and Chloe stormed in. She slammed a formal, gold-embossed envelope onto Dominic's desk. "A courier just dropped this off," Chloe said, her voice shaking with rage. "It's a summons from Montgomery Global." Dominic tore the envelope open. It was a formal invitation, on thick, expensive cardstock, requesting the presence of Dominic Blackwood at Montgomery Tower on Friday at 10 a.m. for an executive vendor review. "I'm going," Dominic said, his jaw tightening. "I'm going to look her in the eye and remind her of who we used to be. She's playing hardball, but she's still Clara. I know how to handle her." Chloe scoffed, crossing her arms. "You'd better, Dom, because if you lose this company, you lose everything. I didn't sign up to date a bankrupt, failed developer." Dominic shot her a sharp, betrayed look, but didn't argue. He knew the conditional nature of Chloe's affection. The next morning, Dominic walked into the sprawling lobby of Montgomery Tower. The building was a monument to wealth and power, soaring 80 stories above the Seattle skyline. He felt distinctly small as a silent, imposing security guard escorted him to a private express elevator. When the doors opened on the top floor, Dominic stepped into a reception area that looked like a modern art gallery. Fiona Caldwell greeted him with a polite, empty smile. "Mr. Blackwood, Miss Montgomery is expecting you in the primary boardroom. Right this way." Dominic adjusted his tie, pasting on his most charming, confident smile. He walked into the boardroom, expecting to find the timid, quiet woman he had lived with for 5 years. Instead, he found an empress. Clara was seated at the head of a 20-foot marble table. She wore a sharp, tailored white suit that radiated authority. The Seattle skyline sprawled behind her, framing her like a portrait of absolute dominance. She didn't stand when he entered. She simply steepled her fingers and watched him walk the long distance from the door to the opposite end of the table. "Hello, Dominic," Clara said. Her voice was smooth, cold, and utterly detached. Dominic's charming smile faltered. He took a seat, trying to exude a casual confidence he absolutely did not feel. "Clara, you look incredible. Truly, this whole setup. It's a lot to process." "I imagine it is," Clara replied. "But we are not here to discuss my wardrobe or my family's real estate. You were summoned for a vendor review regarding Blackwood Tech." Dominic leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, trying to close the emotional distance. "Clara, come on. It's me. It's Dom. I know you're angry about the divorce. I know how things ended was messy, but you wouldn't destroy my company. We built this together. Remember the late nights? The takeout boxes in our first apartment? You can't just torch my life out of revenge." Clara's expression didn't change. She didn't look angry. She looked bored. "You misunderstand the situation, Dominic," Clara said, her voice cutting through the air like a scalpel. "This isn't revenge. Revenge is emotional. This is business, and frankly, you are terrible at it." Dominic flushed red, his pride stinging. "Terrible at it? I built a company valued at $200 million. I revolutionized supply chain software." "Did you?" Clara asked, raising a single eyebrow. She gestured to Gabriel Smith, who was sitting silently in the corner shadows. Gabrielle stepped forward and slid a blue manila folder down the long marble table. It stopped perfectly in front of Dominic. "Open it," Clara commanded. Dominic, hands trembling slightly, opened the folder. He saw the patent registration forms. He saw the lines of core architectural code. And then he saw the name of the registered owner. Bluebird Solutions, LLC. Sole proprietor, Clara E. Montgomery. "What is this?" Dominic whispered, the blood draining from his face. "That," Clara said, leaning forward, her eyes locking onto his with terrifying intensity, "is the beating heart of your entire company. The algorithm you claimed was your genius stroke. I wrote it on a Sunday afternoon while you were off playing golf with venture capitalists who were laughing behind your back. I gave it to you because I loved you, and I wanted to see you succeed." Dominic couldn't speak. He stared at the documents, his mind frantically trying to process the magnitude of the disaster. "Blackwood Tech doesn't own its core product, Dominic," Clara continued, her voice echoing in the silent room. "You are utilizing proprietary software owned by Bluebird Solutions, and Bluebird Solutions has just been acquired by Montgomery Global." You set me up!" Dominic gasped, looking up at her with a mix of horror and fury. "I didn't set you up," Clara corrected him smoothly. "I held a safety net under you for 5 years. At the divorce table, when you fought so aggressively to keep the company and leave me with $60,000, you inadvertently cut your own safety net. You bought the shell. I kept the engine." Dominic stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. This is illegal. I'll sue you. I'll drag this through court for a decade." Clara smiled, a chilling, triumphant smirk that mirrored the exact one he had given her in the law office weeks ago. "With what money, Dominic?" she asked softly. "Apex Freight has frozen your accounts. Your Bellevue lease is bleeding you dry. In exactly 4 days you will default on your payroll. You don't have the capital to fight a parking ticket, let alone the legal army of Montgomery Global." She stood up, buttoning her white suit jacket with a final dismissive movement. "Your company is worthless, Dominic. And by Friday, everyone in Silicon Valley will know it. You are dismissed." The descent in the express elevator of Montgomery Tower felt like a free fall to Dominic. His chest was tight, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. He stumbled out into the marble lobby, completely ignoring the stares of the security guards, and burst through the revolving glass doors into the rainy Seattle afternoon. He had no umbrella. He didn't care. The cold rain soaked through his $2,000 custom Italian suit, plastering his hair to his forehead. He pulled out his phone, his fingers slick and shaking, and dialed his wealth manager at Goldman Sachs, a man named Harrison Ford. No relation to the actor, but a man who held Dominic's entire fragile financial ecosystem in his hands. "Harrison," Dominic gasped as the call connected. "I need a bridge loan. $2 million. Against my equity in Blackwood Tech." There was a long, excruciating silence on the other end of the line. "Dominic," Harrison said, his voice stripped of the usual sycophantic warmth he reserved for wealthy clients. "I was just about to call you. The news about Montgomery Global acquiring Bluebird Solutions just hit Bloomberg Terminal. More importantly, the IP audit notification regarding Blackwood Tech was flagged by our risk assessment algorithm. Harrison, listen to me," Dominic pleaded, pacing frantically on the wet sidewalk. "It's a misunderstanding, a temporary roadblock. I just need capital to make payroll on Friday, and then I can restructure." "I can't authorize a loan, Dominic," Harrison interrupted coldly. "Your equity is currently valued at 0. In fact, given the impending lawsuits for intellectual property theft that Montgomery Global's legal team is undoubtedly drafting, you are a toxic asset. The bank is calling in the margin loan you took out for the Bellevue office lease. You have 48 hours to clear the balance of $1.4 million, or we begin seizing personal assets." The line went dead. Dominic stared at his phone as the rain washed over the screen. He was completely, utterly ruined. When he finally pushed open the glass doors of Blackwood Tech an hour later, the atmosphere had shifted from toxic to apocalyptic. The open-plan office, usually buzzing with the sound of mechanical keyboards and arrogant tech bros playing ping-pong, was dead silent. Dozens of employees were clustered around monitors. A few were already packing their personal belongings into cardboard boxes. Peter, the CFO, intercepted Dominic before he could even reach his corner office. Peter looked pale and exhausted, holding a printed sheet of paper. "It's over, Dom," Peter said, not bothering to lower his voice. Apex Freight didn't just freeze the invoice, they officially cancelled the contract. Breach of intellectual property clauses. The news leaked to TechCrunch 20 minutes ago. Dominic grabbed the paper from Peter's hand. The headline screamed back at him, "Blackwood Tech exposed, flagship algorithm owned by Montgomery Heiress." "We can fight this," Dominic croaked, his voice cracking. "We can write a new algorithm. We have the best engineers." "We had the best engineers," Peter corrected him bitterly. 3 of the senior developers just got poached by a recruiter from Montgomery Global. They offered them double their current salaries and full benefits starting Monday. And since you haven't paid them their quarterly bonuses, they walked out 10 minutes ago. I'm resigning, Dominic. Effective immediately. Good luck." Peter turned and walked away, leaving Dominic standing alone in the center of the office he had built with Clara's stolen brilliance. He retreated to his glass-walled office, pulling the blinds shut for the first time since he moved in. He collapsed into his expensive ergonomic chair and buried his face in his hands. He stayed there for hours, listening to the muffled sounds of his company dismantling itself outside his door. Around 8 p.m., his phone buzzed. It was a text from Chloe. "We need to talk. Come back to the penthouse." A small spark of desperate hope flared in Dominic's chest. Chloe was ruthless, yes, but she was also a brilliant PR strategist. Maybe she had a plan. Maybe she knew how to spin this, how to craft a narrative of the oppressed startup founder crushed by the vindictive billionaire. He practically ran out of the empty office, driving his leased Porsche 911 through the slick streets toward the Four Seasons. When he unlocked the door to the penthouse, the first thing he noticed was the empty space in the hallway, where Chloe's 3 Louis Vuitton steamer trunks usually sat. He walked into the living room. Chloe was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, wearing a sharp trench coat, her designer handbag slung over her shoulder. She looked immaculate, composed, and completely detached. "Chloe?" Dominic asked, his voice trembling. "Where are your bags?" She turned to face him, her expression a mask of pure, calculated indifference. "They're downstairs with the bellhop. I called a black car to take me to the airport." Dominic stepped forward, reaching out a hand. "Wait, what? You're leaving? Now?" "Chloe, I need you. We can fix this. You're the head of PR. You can spin the narrative." Chloe let out a sharp, mocking laugh that cut Dominic to the bone. It sounded eerily similar to the laugh he had given Clara at the divorce table. "Spin the narrative?" Chloe asked, shaking her head. "Dominic, you don't have a narrative. You have a fraud charge waiting to happen. You built a house of cards on code your mousy ex-wife wrote, and you were too stupid to secure the patent. You aren't a visionary. You're a con artist who got caught by someone infinitely smarter than you." "I loved you," Dominic yelled, the betrayal tearing through him. "I left my wife for you." "You left your wife because you wanted a trophy to match the ego you didn't earn," Chloe fired back, her eyes narrowing. "And I stayed with you because I thought you were a rocket ship to the Forbes list. But the engine just fell out, Dom. I'm 32. I don't have time to hold the hand of a bankrupt failure." She walked past him, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. She paused at the door, glancing back over her shoulder. "Oh, and by the way," she said casually, "the credit card you gave me for PR expenses? It was declined at the Cartier boutique this afternoon. You might want to look into that. Goodbye, Dominic." The heavy oak door clicked shut, sealing Dominic in absolute silence. He was alone. No company, no money, no girlfriend, and absolutely no pride. 3 months later, the dust had finally settled. The fall of Dominic Blackwood was a spectacle that the Seattle business community discussed in hushed, awe-struck tones. It was a masterclass in corporate demolition, orchestrated with terrifying precision by Clara Montgomery. The bankruptcy proceedings were brutal and swift, because Dominic had signed that divorce settlement, taking on the full mortgage of the suburban house, and because he had leveraged everything he owned against the failed Series B funding. The banks descended like vultures. His leased Porsche was repossessed in the parking lot of a cheap motel in Tacoma, where he had been forced to rent a room by the week. The bank foreclosed on the suburban house he had so smugly kicked Clara out of. Even the expensive Rolex Clara had bought him for their anniversary was pawned just to afford groceries and a burner phone. He was blacklisted. No tech firm in the Pacific Northwest would hire him. His name was toxic, synonymous with intellectual property theft and staggering arrogance. He had been reduced to interviewing for entry-level IT support roles under a modified resume, desperate to scrape together rent. Meanwhile, Clara Montgomery was reshaping the world. Under her leadership, Montgomery Global launched a new initiative focused on ethical supply chain logistics, drastically reducing carbon emissions across their global shipping routes. She was featured on the cover of Time magazine, dubbed the architect of the new economy. She was poised, elegant, and universally respected. One crisp Tuesday afternoon, Dominic found himself standing on a street corner in downtown Seattle, clutching a paper cup of cheap deli coffee. He was wearing an old, slightly frayed coat, a stark contrast to the custom suits he used to parade around in. He looked up at the towering, glass-fronted facade of the new Montgomery Tech Innovation Center, a multi-million-dollar campus Clara had just finished building. A massive crowd of reporters, city officials, and industry leaders were gathered outside for the ribbon-cutting ceremony. Dominic pulled his collar up, trying to hide his face, but he couldn't look away. Through the crowd, he saw her. Clara stepped up to the podium. She was radiant, wearing a tailored navy blue coat that looked suspiciously similar to the cheap one she used to wear, only this one was spun from vicuna wool and cost more than a car. The crowd fell silent as she smiled, a genuine, warm smile that Dominic realized he hadn't seen in years. Standing beside her was a man. He wasn't flashy. He didn't wear a velvet tuxedo or a Rolex. He was a tall, quietly confident man in a simple charcoal suit. Alexander Thorne, the fiercely intelligent and notoriously private CEO of a renewable energy firm, who had recently become Clara's closest collaborator and, according to the tabloids, her partner. Alexander looked at Clara with a level of deep respect and admiration that Dominic had never bothered to offer her. As Clara finished her speech and raised the ceremonial scissors to cut the ribbon, the crowd erupted into applause. Cameras flashed, capturing the triumph of a woman who had been underestimated her entire life. Dominic stood on the cold pavement, watching the woman he had discarded conquer the world. The weight of his own profound stupidity crushed him. He hadn't just lost a $20 billion empire. He had lost a brilliant, loyal, and incredibly patient woman who had loved him when he had absolutely nothing. Clara turned away from the cameras to shake hands with the mayor. For a brief, fleeting moment, her gaze drifted past the barricades and landed on the street corner. She saw him. Dominic froze, his breath catching in his throat. He expected anger. He expected her to point him out to security, to gloat, to flash that terrifying, victorious smirk she had shown him at the gala. But she didn't. Clara Montgomery looked at the broken, shivering man holding a cheap cup of coffee, and her expression softened into something far worse than anger. It was pity. She offered him a slow, polite nod of acknowledgement, the kind of nod one gives a stranger asking for directions, before turning her back on him completely, slipping her arm through Alexander's, and walking into the warmth and brilliance of her newly built empire. Dominic lowered his head, the rain beginning to fall once more, and turned to walk back to his motel room, finally understanding the true cost of his arrogance. He hadn't just lost the game, he had been entirely deleted from the board. The rain in Tacoma didn't just fall, it seeped. It seeped into the cracked linoleum of room 114 at the Starlight Motel, and it seeped into Dominic Blackwood's bones. It had been 4 months since the ribbon-cutting ceremony. Dominic's life had devolved into a bleak routine of dodging debt collectors, eating canned soup, and staring at a cracked laptop screen. His bank accounts were negative. His credit was destroyed. But as he sat in the gloom of his motel room, listening to the drip of a leaky faucet, a desperate, dangerous idea began to form in his mind. Before Clara had rewritten the foundational architecture of Blackwood Tech, Dominic had built a primitive, flawed version of the software. It was buggy and inefficient. But hidden deep within the legacy code was a back door, a developer's access point he had created to bypass security protocols during the early testing phases. Clara, in her brilliance, had built the new, perfect algorithm right over the top of his old architecture, assuming he had deleted his original access keys. He hadn't. Dominic's hands flew across his sticky, worn keyboard. If he could access the Montgomery global servers through that forgotten back door, he wouldn't just have access to Apex Freight's logistics. He would have the routing data for half the global supply chain. It was worth hundreds of millions to the right buyer. He didn't need billions anymore. He just needed enough to run. A cool $5 million, wired to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands, and he could disappear to a country without an extradition treaty. He accessed the dark web, utilizing encrypted messaging boards to reach out to a notorious corporate espionage syndicate known only as the Vanguard Group. Within 48 hours, he had a buyer, a rival overseas shipping conglomerate willing to pay $7 million for the backdoor access keys and the live routing data. The exchange was set. Tuesday night, 11 p.m., at an abandoned rail yard on the outskirts of Seattle. Dominic arrived early, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The damp night air smelled of rust and rotting wood. He clutched a reinforced flash drive in his pocket, his golden ticket. A sleek, black SUV with tinted windows rolled silently over the gravel, its headlights cutting through the fog. The vehicle stopped 20 feet away. The driver's side door opened, and a man in a sharp black trench coat stepped out. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried a metallic briefcase. "You have the access protocols?" the man asked, his voice a low, raspy whisper. "I have them," Dominic said, stepping out from the shadows of a rusted train car. His voice shook slightly. "Do you have the routing numbers for the offshore transfer?" The man tapped the briefcase. "The transfer will be initiated the moment we verify the integrity of the code. Hand over the drive." Dominic hesitated. This was the point of no return. Wire fraud, corporate espionage, and grand larceny. If he handed over the drive, he was a felon, but the alternative was rotting in a Tacoma motel room for the rest of his life. He pulled the flash drive from his pocket and held it out. The man stepped forward and took it. He plugged it into a ruggedized tablet he pulled from his coat. The screen illuminated his face in a harsh blue glow. "Verification in progress," the man muttered. Dominic held his breath, waiting for the green light, waiting for his phone to buzz with the confirmation of a $7 million deposit. Instead, a blinding white spotlight suddenly snapped on from the top of the adjacent warehouse, illuminating the entire rail yard like a stadium. Dominic threw his hands over his eyes, stumbling backward. "What the hell is this?" he screamed. The loud, unmistakable screech of police sirens shattered the quiet night. 3 armored tactical vehicles burst through the chain-link gates, completely boxing in the black SUV. Heavily armed agents poured out, their weapons drawn. "FBI, hands in the air! Do not move!" The man in the trench coat didn't run. He didn't even flinch. He calmly closed his tablet, placed the flash drive into a plastic evidence bag, and pulled a gold badge from his pocket, hanging it around his neck. "Special Agent David Russo, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Cyber Crimes Division," the man announced, his voice echoing across the yard. "Dominic Blackwood, you are under arrest for attempted corporate espionage, wire fraud, and violation of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act." Dominic's knees gave out. He collapsed onto the wet gravel, the sharp stones biting into his skin. His mind could not comprehend what was happening. The Vanguard Group was supposed to be a ghost. How did the FBI find him? From the shadows behind the blinding spotlight, 2 figures walked slowly toward him. The first was Gabriel Smith, the chief financial officer of Montgomery Global. The second was Clara. She was dressed in a pristine white wool coat, holding a large black umbrella that shielded her from the drizzle. She looked down at Dominic, her face an unreadable mask of absolute calm. "How?" Dominic choked out, his voice cracking as tears of pure terror streamed down his face. "How did you know?" Clara stopped a few feet away from him. The FBI agents moved in, grabbing Dominic by the arms and hauling him roughly to his feet, pulling his hands behind his back to secure the steel handcuffs. "Did you honestly think, Dominic, that I would leave a back door open in my own architecture?" Clara asked softly, her voice carrying easily over the sound of the rain. "I knew about your little access port the day I rewrote the code 5 years ago. I didn't close it. I turned it into a honeypot." Dominic stared at her, horrified. A honeypot?" "A trap," Gabriel Smith clarified, adjusting his glasses. "Any attempt to access that port triggers an immediate silent alarm directly to the cybersecurity division of Montgomery Global and simultaneously alerts the FBI. The moment you pinged the server from that motel's IP address, we were watching your screen in real time. The buyer, Dominic whispered, looking at Agent Russo. The Vanguard Group doesn't exist, Agent Russo said flatly. It's a front operated by the Bureau to catch corporate data thieves. You walked right into a federal sting operation, Mr. Blackwood. Clara tilted her umbrella slightly, studying the broken, shivering man she had once called her husband. I told you at the tower, Dominic. This isn't revenge. It's business, Clara said, her tone devoid of malice or triumph. You tried to steal from Montgomery Global. That is a line I do not allow anyone to cross. Clara, please, Dominic begged, struggling against the grips of the federal agents. The handcuffs bit into his wrists. They'll put me in federal prison. I'll lose decades. You've already taken everything. Please just tell them to drop the charges. You owe me. We were married. Clara's eyes hardened, turning to absolute ice. I owed you a partnership, Dominic, and I gave you one. I gave you my money, my time, my intellect, and my loyalty. You repaid me with a $62,000 divorce settlement. And a smirk, Clara said, her voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly whisper. You are not a victim. You are just a man who finally has to pay the bill. She turned away. Take him away, Agent Russo, Clara commanded, walking back toward the waiting fleet of Montgomery Global vehicles. Dominic's screams echoed through the rail yard as he was shoved into the back of an armored FBI transport van. The heavy metal doors slammed shut, plunging him into total darkness. 6 months later, the trial of the United States versus Dominic Blackwood concluded in a federal courthouse. Dominic sat at the defense table, wearing an ill-fitting orange jumpsuit, his face pale and gaunt. Chloe Hastings had been subpoenaed to testify against him in exchange for immunity regarding her own use of stolen company funds, delivering the final, crushing blow to his character on the witness stand. Judge Harrison Caldwell did not look at Dominic with pity. He looked at him with profound disgust. Mr. Blackwood, Judge Caldwell's voice boomed through the quiet courtroom. Your actions demonstrate a staggering level of arrogance, greed, and a complete disregard for the law. You attempted to compromise the security of international trade networks for your own selfish financial gain. It is the judgment of this court that you be remanded to the custody of the Federal Bureau of Prisons for a period of 15 years, without the possibility of early parole. The gavel slammed down. Dominic closed his eyes as the bailiffs grabbed his arms. It was over. The empire he thought he built was dust. The woman he thought he had outgrown now ruled the world. And the smirk that had started it all had finally, permanently, been wiped from his face. Miles away, in the penthouse office of Montgomery Tower, Clara Montgomery stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the thriving city of Seattle. The sun was breaking through the clouds, casting a golden light over the glass and steel skyline. Her chief of staff, Fiona, stepped into the room. Miss Montgomery, the board is ready for the global expansion vote. Clara smiled, a genuine, quiet smile of a woman entirely at peace with her power. Let's go build the future, Fiona. And that is the ultimate checkmate. Dominic thought he could outsmart the quiet woman sitting across from him, but he didn't realize Clara was playing chess while he was barely playing checkers. From that arrogant smirk at the divorce table to sitting in a federal courtroom in an orange jumpsuit, karma delivered exactly what he deserved. If this story of the hidden heiress taking back her power gave you chills, you have to hit that like button. It helps the channel bring you more incredible, twist-filled real-life dramas just like this. What was your favorite moment of Clara's revenge? Was it the gala entrance or the FBI sting operation? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe and tap the notification bell so you never miss a story. Share this video with a friend who loves seeing arrogance get crushed, and I'll see you in the next one.